This is the Fractal Celsius Plus S28 Prisma. S28, does that mean 280 millimeters? Yes, indeed it does! Finally, we have a 280 millimeter, relatively high fin density cooler from Fractal. The feature list that Fractal gives you is it's a glass top with 6 LED ARGB rings. So that's the top of the pump. Automatic temperature control. I'll talk more about that in a second. Optional manual PWM control mode. Combined fan RGB hub. Prisma AL14 PWM ARGB fans included. It also includes the RGB-ness Fractal Prisma fans. This is 2.38 millimeters of H2O static pressure. So these are relatively high static pressure fans. These are higher static pressure than even the X2 fans, the Dynamic X2, the non-RGB variant of these fans. Which I found with radiators that the more that you're able to force air through the radiator, the better it does. And that sounds really dumb now that I'm saying it, but you know, some people don't realize that. It's like, oh, I've got super quiet fans on my radiator. Why is my radiator super hot? It's like, well, because in order for the radiator to do its job, you need to force air through the radiator. One of the real genius things that Fractal always does with their coolers is they build the wires in to the cabling, the tubing. So you see I've got my 4-pin connection for my CPU, and then I've got the tubing here on this fresh one that I just unboxed. Things are getting kind of spooky up here at the top. So normally you've got your fan connectors here. There's 2 fan connectors plus an additional 4-pin header. So if you're going to run this in a push-pull configuration, you will need a Y cable because you've only got 3 4-pin connections at the top of this little breakout board. This is basically a 3-way splitter, but it's on the 280 millimeter. Maybe that board was intended for like the 360 millimeter where you'd have 3 fans, but if you were going to run 4 fans in a push-pull configuration, 2 of your fans can plug directly into the board, which is nice and neat from a cable management standpoint. But then you've also got your, cables. Now I've got a header here, another header here for the addressable RGB. So I can plug my addressable RGB cable in to the little circuit board, and then I'll have an interface for the RGB. And if you're wondering, yes, in fact, the fans do have RGB in and out. So you don't really need multiple connections on the fans as far as your RGB connections. But still, it is kind of a lot of cables to manage, and it is sort of awesome that Fractal builds that into the cable loops. So one of the things Fractal always does that I like is they build the cables directly into the sleeves. So this glass cover on the pump, yeah, there's 6 addressable RGB LEDs in the cover, and the interface for that is kind of weird. Now the design is an Asetek design, which means it's the circle with the clicky things. So like if you've got a Threadripper CPU, it comes with a Threadripper adapter, but the cold plate on this still isn't large enough for a Threadripper in my opinion. If you're gonna run like a 3960, 3970X at stock speeds, it will do fine. That's why AMD includes the Asetek adapter. But this is more suited for, I think, the 3950X, especially if you want a quieter system or a system with, a beefier loop, so like the AM4 3950X or the blast furnace Intel CPUs. They will also work really well with this cooler. So testing this on a 9900KS, it did reasonably well given the 9900KS's blast furnace like heat production capabilities. The 3950X doesn't produce quite as much heat, but the heat that it does produce is in a much more concentrated area because it's the little, the CPU dies, the 2 little CPU dies on the edge of the CPU. The heat spreader on those does a pretty good job spreading the heat out. You don't need a special cooler or anything like that. This cooler did reasonably well on my 3950X, although I did get like 3 degrees C better adding aftermarket thermal paste. The Arctic MX4 with this setup did a little better than this particular built-in cooling system. Probably should have used an Intel CPU with my thermal paste. Just got this one in, and I'm gonna try an Intel CPU with the thermal paste and see how it goes. But yeah, built-in thermal paste. Don't screw it up installing your CPU, otherwise you're gonna have to scrape that off and repaste it. So one thing that I noticed this time around is that even when it's in PWM control mode, if the cooling fluid goes over about 55 degrees C, everything goes to 100%. And with these fans, the Fractal fans, that's completely fine because these max out at something like 1700 to 2000 RPM. They're not going to get super loud. But if you have replaced these with louder fans, or you're doing a push-pull configuration and you're running it off the same hub, if your liquid temperature goes above 55 degrees C, it's gonna run at 100%. And finally, it's a 5-year warranty. The build quality and all the accoutrement, as an aside, in the manual it recommends placement at the bottom front of the case is one of the recommended spots for placing it. It also recommends the top of the case, but even with the Fractal Define 7, at least for the big boy motherboards that I run, there's not really enough room, in my opinion, at the top. Maybe the Define 7 XL, but the Define 7 with a 280mm radiator at the top is just, I'm not comfortable with the level of clearance that's there. I'd rather have a 360 in the top and a 280 in the front. And you can also run a 280 in the bottom on some of those Fractal cases, which is, a nice cold air from the bottom intake, as long as the case is gonna have plenty of breathing room. It's not a bad choice. Overall, I'm pretty satisfied with this, especially with the relatively high static pressure fans on the Fractal coolers. On the, I think it's the Celsius S28. It's been a while now. One of the things I was a little worried about with those is those fans are quiet, even at maximum, like 1000, 1200 RPM. I didn't feel like they were moving enough air through the Celsius S28. I'm happy to say that is not a problem on the Celsius Plus S28 Prisma. These fans move a lot of air through that radiator. And that's what you need for good cooling. I'm Whittle, this is level 1. This is a first look at the new 280mm cooler from Fractal. It's the Fractal aesthetic, but now available in 280mm. Cooler as in emitting less black body radiation, as opposed to more awesome than you could get one of these. Otherwise, the stock cooler with an AMD CPU is fine.